Few could have imagined that within medical institutions, where people spend their final days, staff members regularly encounter extraordinary phenomena that neither science nor medicine can explain. But that doesn't make them any less real. Doctors and nurses, often seen as skeptics by default, have quietly witnessed events that defy every rational theory. Some choose silence. Others, however, find the courage to speak. This story is about 4 world-renowned hospice nurses who broke that silence. What they shared isn't faith, it's testimony. It's not a belief, it's lived experience. These women didn't seek attention or fame, they simply could no longer ignore what they had seen while caring for the dying. What they witnessed, again and again, was something sacred, mysterious, and undeniable. This truth, born not from books or philosophy but from thousands of final moments, may forever change how we view death. And perhaps, in listening to their voices, we'll finally begin to understand what really waits for us on the other side. Barbara Karnes never set out to become a national authority on dying. She was simply a nurse, dedicated to caring for those whose time was running out. But what she saw at the bedsides of the dying transformed her, and ultimately, the way millions of people now understand the final chapter of life. Born in 1941, Barbara entered nursing right after high school, spending decades working in hospices and home care. Over the years, she became more than a caregiver. She became an observer, a witness to the moments when science stops and something else, something beyond, begins to take shape. Her booklet, Gone From My Sight, The Dying Experience, was written in 1985 and has since sold over 45 million copies worldwide, translated into 12 languages. In almost every hospice in America, this small, unassuming guide is handed to families as they prepare to say goodbye to a loved one. But what makes Barbara's voice so powerful isn't just her clarity about the physical stages of death, it's her willingness to speak about the things that can't be measured. The visions, the visitors, the sense of peace that so many dying people report in their final hours. Barbara is not a spiritualist. She doesn't preach. She doesn't speculate. She simply tells the truth of what she has seen. And what she has seen, over and over again, are moments that challenge everything we think we know about death. She has heard patients speak to loved ones who had passed years earlier. She has watched as people, weak and unresponsive for days, suddenly opened their eyes, smiled, and said, "Mom, you're here." Then moments later, they were gone. For Barbara, the most common figure to appear at the end is the mother, perhaps the earliest and deepest bond in a person's life. She believes these visions aren't hallucinations, but bridges between worlds. They bring comfort, clarity, and most of all, peace. What struck Barbara most was how universal these experiences were. It didn't matter if the person was religious or not, young or old, rich or poor. Again and again, people reported the same kinds of encounters: lights, music, loving presences, or visions of family members waiting nearby. One woman, who had been restless all night, finally fell into a peaceful sleep. In the morning, in Barbara's presence, she awoke briefly, stared into the corner of the room and whispered, "Mom, I'm so glad to see you." Then, she died. Another patient, only 52 years old, was terrified of death and insisted she would fight it until the end. But just 2 days before she passed, she began raising her head and having short conversations with someone invisible. When asked who she was speaking to, she calmly replied, "My father." Shortly before her death, she told Barbara, "It's okay, I'm not scared anymore." Barbara has no clinical explanation for these moments. She doesn't claim to understand the mechanism, but she has seen them too many times to doubt their reality. "I can't explain these cases," she says, "but I witnessed them, so I believe in them." Some patients see more than just family. There are stories of people describing places of beauty, brilliant lights, angelic singing, and unknown figures radiating love. One elderly woman, in her final hours, looked upward and said, "Do you see those lights? They want me to follow them." A few minutes later, she passed away. Another described the sound of a choir and the sensation of wings brushing her face. "There's something more than the physical dimension," Barbara says. And she's convinced that as death approaches, the veil between worlds becomes thinner. One of the most remarkable cases involved a man who spent days talking to his deceased parents. Then, on the final afternoon, he turned to Barbara and said, "I'm going home. It's so beautiful there. with lights and clouds everywhere. He died that same day. The consistency of these visions, across different backgrounds, beliefs, and conditions, has led Barbara to believe that death is not a sudden drop into darkness, but a transition into something greater. Something that is waiting for us. Her belief is not rooted in religion and observation. She emphasizes that these experiences aren't limited to people with spiritual leanings. Even atheists have described similar visions before passing, visions that calm them, comfort them, and prepare them for what's next. Barbara believes that these moments are deeply personal, but also deeply real. They aren't figments of imagination. They are, in her words, sacred farewells. Families, too, have reported strange phenomena that support Barbara's experiences. A daughter might hear her mother's favorite song at the moment of death. A room might suddenly fill with a scent tied to the deceased's memory. Sometimes, several family members see or feel the same thing. Lights, warmth, a presence. These shared experiences are harder to dismiss, and Barbara includes them in her talks to illustrate that death affects more than just the person dying. It creates a moment of spiritual opening for everyone nearby. After decades in hospice care, Barbara reached a profound conclusion. Most people don't fear death itself, they fear the unknown. But what she saw over and over again was that in the final hours, that fear often disappeared. People who had been anxious or resistant suddenly relaxed, their breathing slowed, their faces softened, and in many cases they smiled. Something had shifted. Something unseen had entered the room. Barbara's work is now taught in nursing schools, discussed in medical conferences, and passed from hand to hand in waiting rooms across the world. Yet she remains humble. "I'm not trying to convince anyone," she often says. "I'm just telling you what I've seen." And what she's seen is powerful enough to change lives. For those who still view death as a terrifying void, Barbara's message is quietly revolutionary. It says, "You are not alone. When your time comes, someone will be there. You will be met, not by fear, but by familiarity. And perhaps, like so many of her patients, you'll find yourself smiling at someone only you can see, whispering, 'I'm so glad you're here.' And then, at peace, you'll let go." Penny Smith never thought she would believe in life after death. Raised in a household where religion was never discussed, and surrounded by a world that often dismissed such ideas, she saw death as something final, terrifying, and empty. "I wasn't afraid of hell," she once said, "but the idea of death itself terrified me." That fear stayed with her until she began working in hospice care. What she witnessed there shattered every assumption she had held. It didn't take decades to change her mind. Within 6 months, she found herself believing that something waits for us beyond the final breath. The turning point came not from a textbook, but from a dream. Penny had just lost her father, and the night after his funeral, she saw him. He appeared to her not as a ghost or shadow, but as a warm, glowing presence made of orange light. He said only one thing, that he was doing well and that she shouldn't grieve so much. When she awoke, Penny felt shaken, but also strangely comforted. That dream, she says, was the first clear sign that death wasn't the end. Her brother, skeptical and firm in disbelief, dismissed it immediately. But her mother and sister were silent, visibly affected. A year later, her sister had a similar dream. This time, their father came to offer advice about a family issue. Their mother, once unsure, eventually began dreaming of her husband regularly, calling him her guardian angel, who warned her of danger during the day. As Penny continued working in hospice, the unexplainable became almost routine. Patients on the edge of death would often reach into the air, as if grasping for something just above their heads. Some made motions that mirrored long-forgotten habits, embroidering with invisible thread, hanging laundry, fishing. Others blew kisses to someone no one else could see, or smiled into an empty doorway. Penny began to understand that these were not meaningless gestures. Many patients, just days before death, begin seeing and interacting with what she calls visitors. These are often deceased relatives, pets, or radiant figures. The visits usually start about 2 weeks before death, and as the moment draws closer, the clarity of these visions intensifies. One of the most unsettling yet fascinating patterns Penny noticed involves what she describes as shedding. In their final hours, some patients begin rubbing or scratching at their own skin, as if trying to remove it. While some might interpret this as a symptom, Penny believes it is something deeper, a symbolic act of release. "It's as if they're trying to shed their body," she said, "like a snake releasing its old skin." It's not a medical fact, but it's a reflection from someone who has watched hundreds of people in their last moments, and she's convinced there's meaning in what others overlook. Penny's work also brought her into contact with animals, particularly dogs, who often seemed to sense death before humans did. In one hospice room, a dying man lay unconscious, unresponsive for days. The only thing that comforted him was his small dog, a chihuahua who lay at his side. In a neighboring room, another patient, a woman with a terminal illness, had made a stunning decision. She knew she was dying and wanted to hear, for once in her life, the kinds of kind words people only say at funerals. With no living family, she invited the entire hospice staff to a farewell party. They stood around her bed, raised glasses of non-alcoholic champagne, and each one shared something kind and heartfelt. When the final person finished speaking, the woman smiled and died peacefully. What happened next is something Penny will never forget. At the exact moment the woman passed, the chihuahua in the neighboring room suddenly woke up and began barking. The man, still unconscious, opened his eyes, sat up, and stared at the open door. "Who are you?" he asked, looking directly at something no one else could see. He seemed to listen for a moment, then lay back down and returned to silence. There was no one in the doorway, but the timing was unmistakable. It was as if the departing soul of the woman had passed by, and for one fleeting moment, the veil between life and death grew thin enough to stir those on both sides. These kinds of stories, strange, beautiful, and impossible to explain, became the foundation of Penny's belief that life doesn't end when the heart stops. It simply changes form. Again and again, she saw patients describe reunions, speak of light, or call out names of long-lost loved ones. One woman, who had not spoken in days, suddenly opened her eyes and called out, "Katie, did you come for me?" Moments later, she died. Penny remembers the peace on her face. Even patients who had been blind for years would suddenly see the visitors in their rooms. They would name names, smile at faces they couldn't physically have seen for decades, and react with joy. This wasn't confusion. This was recognition. Penny began to trust these moments more than anything she had learned in nursing school. When someone smiles at the ceiling, she says, we don't correct them. We know someone is there. For Penny Smith, the fear of death faded not because someone told her to believe, but because the dying themselves became her teachers. They showed her, through gesture, word, silence, and vision, that something greater was happening. Something that science couldn't measure, but the soul could sense. And now, after more than 2 decades at the bedside, she's certain, no one dies alone. Someone always comes. You just have to be willing to see it. Joy Ufema never set out to become a pioneer. She was a nurse from Pennsylvania, grounded in the clinical world of medicine, dedicated to helping people through some of the most difficult moments of their lives. But what she witnessed during her decades-long career changed her forever, and changed how thousands of others now understand the process of dying. In the 1970s, at a time when death was rarely discussed openly and certainly not studied scientifically, Joy became the first officially recognized thanatologist nurse in the United States. Thanatology, the study of death and dying, was almost unheard of in the medical field. But Joy didn't just study it, she lived it. She sat at the bedsides of the dying, not just to administer medication, but to listen. And what she heard, again and again, defied explanation. Patients who had not spoken in days would suddenly open their eyes and say things like, "She's here," or "They've come for me." Others would announce with calm certainty, "Today's the day," or ask family members to gather because it's time. And in many of those cases, they were right. They died exactly when they said they would. Some even smiled before taking their final breath, as if seeing something, or someone, that brought them peace. Joy coined the term nearing death awareness to describe this phenomenon. It was her way of giving a name to what so many hospice workers observed but rarely discussed. A distinct state of consciousness that occurs in the final hours or days of life. Patients in this state often seem more lucid than they've been in weeks. They begin speaking about journeys, destinations, or people they see who are no longer living. They might talk about lights, music, or even smells that aren't present in the room. What struck Joy most was that these experiences were not random or chaotic. They followed patterns, they carried meaning, and most importantly, they brought comfort, not confusion. One story Joy often shared involved a young boy who had a terminal illness. He was quiet, thoughtful, and aware that his time was near. The day before he died, he took his mother's hand and said, "Don't cry, Mommy. I'm going to play with Grandpa now." There was no fear in his voice, only certainty and peace. The next morning, he passed away quietly in his sleep. Another woman, frail and nearing the end, had been unresponsive for hours. Suddenly, she opened her eyes, smiled, and said, "It's so beautiful. I can hear them singing." Those were her last words. She died moments later, her face still lit with joy. Joy Ufema never forgot that moment. In her mind, it was proof that death isn't just the end. It's a transition into something else. Something sacred. Not all experiences were so direct. Some involved senses that seemed heightened in impossible ways. Patients who had lost their ability to smell would suddenly describe the scent of roses or a favorite perfume. Others heard music, soft, distant, yet unmistakably beautiful. And some, who had been blind for years, would speak of light. Not just seeing it, but feeling drawn to it. Joy also documented what are known as shared death experiences. Moments when not just the dying person, but someone nearby, also felt or saw something extraordinary. One woman, miles away from her dying mother, reported that at the exact time of her mother's passing, her room filled with light, and she smelled her mother's favorite perfume. Another daughter swore she heard her father's voice in her living room, hours before the hospital called to say he had died. These experiences couldn't be dismissed as imagination or grief. They were too specific, too timely. Joy emphasized that many of these patients were not under heavy sedation. In fact, she preferred to reduce medications when possible in the final hours, precisely so she could better understand what was real and what might be drug-induced. Time after time, she found that the most profound experiences occurred when the mind was clear, not clouded. These weren't hallucinations. These were farewells. There was a man who had been unconscious for over a day. Without warning, he opened his eyes and said simply, "Now." At that exact moment, the heart monitor showed a brief surge, an unexplained spike, before flatlining. The medical team checked the equipment. There was no malfunction. Something had passed through, something no machine could measure. What made Joy's approach so revolutionary wasn't just her willingness to talk about these moments, it was the way she treated them as valuable. To her, spiritual care was not optional. It was essential. Dying, she believed, was as much a spiritual event as it was a medical one. She began training other nurses to ask different questions. Do you feel someone is with you, or are you seeing something? Instead of dismissing these visions, she encouraged others to witness them, quietly, respectfully, and without judgment. Over the years, Joy stopped trying to explain these events. She didn't need to. The pattern, the peace, and the repetition spoke for themselves. She knew what she had seen, and she knew what it meant to those who were dying. It meant they weren't alone. It meant someone was waiting. One of Joy's most haunting memories came from a patient who had been deeply fearful of death. For weeks, he resisted, panicked at the thought of letting go. But one day, he looked toward the corner of the room, tears in his eyes, and whispered, "She came." Then he smiled, closed his eyes, and passed. Joy Ufema spent her life sitting with people in their final hours. She listened when others looked away. And what she heard wasn't silence. It was music. It was laughter. It was goodbye and reunion. She never claimed to know exactly what happens when we die. But she knew one thing for certain. Something happens. Something real. Something beautiful. And if we stop long enough to listen, we might realize that the dying are trying to tell us. Julie McFadden is one of the most recognizable hospice nurses in the world today. Not because she set out to be famous, but because she chose to speak honestly about what most people are too afraid to even whisper. With a calm voice, compassionate presence, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, Julie has taken to platforms like YouTube and TikTok to talk openly about death, dying, and the incredible things she has witnessed in her years working at the bedside. Her book, Nothing to Fear, quickly gained attention not just for its practical advice, but for the depth of insight it offers into one of life's greatest mysteries. Julie doesn't romanticize death, but she does invite us to see it through different eyes, those of the dying themselves. Among the many experiences that shaped her views, one stands above the rest. It happened during a shift like any other, with a patient she had grown close to. He was reclusive, in his 50s, with no real family or friends, and a long history of hoarding that had left his home nearly unlivable. As he approached death, the hospice team cleaned his space, brought in distant relatives, and gave him, for the first time in years, comfort and dignity. On the day he died, Julie said her goodbyes at the end of her shift, thanking him for the bond they'd shared. She felt peace, but as she sat in her car, preparing to drive home, she was suddenly overcome with a wave of joy so powerful it brought her to tears. In her mind, she heard his voice, clear, vibrant, and full of wonder. "Oh my God, Julie, if only you knew how good it is here." She hadn't been in the room, he had already passed. But she knew, in her bones, that what she experienced was real. It was her first shared death experience, and it changed her forever. From that moment on, Julie began to understand that something beyond the physical was happening in the rooms she worked in every day. She began documenting stories. Patients who had been silent for days suddenly began speaking to people no one else could see. One elderly woman whispered, "Jim, what are you doing here?" and smiled, as if in conversation with her deceased husband. Another woman, who had long suffered from illness, spoke of glowing figures that approached her bed one night. The next day, she said they had taken the form of her parents and told her they would return for her soon. She died the following morning, peacefully and without fear. Julie has also heard accounts of angels, though they don't always appear in traditional form. One patient described a little girl who came at night to sit beside her and stroke her hair. This presence brought peace, not fear. And Julie insists that none of these patients were on medications that would cause hallucinations. These experiences were consistent, calm, and deeply meaningful. They did not disrupt reality, they made sense of it. What sets Julie apart is her insistence that we stop trying to control the dying process. Families often panic, desperate to feed, hydrate, and prolong, not realizing that the body knows how to die. Julie explains that in the final days or hours, a dying person doesn't need intravenous fluids or artificial nutrition. Giving them too much water can cause swelling and make breathing more difficult. Instead, she advocates for comfort, for stillness, for honoring the body's natural journey. She teaches that withholding food and water at this stage isn't cruelty, it's compassion. The body slows down, the need fades, and something else begins. Julie's patients have described all kinds of sensations: beautiful music, unknown fragrances, breathtaking landscapes. One man, a former artist, tried to explain the visions he was seeing. "It's like a painting I can't describe," he said. "The colors, there are no words." Another woman, just moments before death, closed her eyes and smiled, whispering, "It's starting." Then she exhaled and was gone. But perhaps the most mysterious moment Julie ever experienced came on a night she was supposed to go home. Her patient, an elderly woman, was close to death, and Julie didn't want to leave her alone. As she stood in the room, adjusting pillows and speaking softly, she suddenly felt something change. She turned and saw a presence. It wasn't a person, not in the usual sense. It looked like a towering figure, almost like a statue from a cathedral. Majestic, solid, and unlike anything she'd ever seen. Julie didn't feel fear, she felt awe. She knew, instinctively, that this was a being sent to guide the woman across. Quietly, reverently, she stepped out of the room, leaving them together. The next morning she returned, expecting to find that the woman had passed. But instead, the patient was sitting up in bed, eating breakfast, smiling, alive. The woman would go on to live 3 more months. Julie realized that not all visitors come to take. Some, she believes, come to give, to grant more time, to offer reprieve. Julie McFadden doesn't ask anyone to take her word for it, she simply tells the truth as she's lived it. Over and over, she has seen the veil grow thin. She has watched as patients lift their arms toward unseen hands. She has listened as they say goodbye to people no one else can see. She has felt the room change when someone arrives. For her, these are not stories, they are moments. Real, powerful, undeniable moments. What makes Julie's message so compelling is its simplicity. She doesn't try to convert or convince. She just tells us what dying people have shown her, that death isn't something to fear. That we are not alone. That when the time comes, someone will be waiting. And maybe, just maybe, when we finally open our eyes for the last time, we'll see that the room is already full of light. Dear friends, if you liked the video, please like it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon.